All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining our exciting webinar with the leaders of Root Inc., Jim Haudan and Rich Berens. Very excited about the session today about blind spots. So let's just jump right into the content and get started. Those of you that are online, feel free to chat in questions and I'll try and work those into the discussion, but we definitely want it to be more of a discussion than a presentation. So I'll turn it over to you guys. Tell me about your book, Blind Spots, and what we're going to cover today.
Thanks, Tim. Much appreciated, and thank you everybody for dialing in on a Monday to spend a little bit of time with us. You know, it's interesting. You know, Jim and I've had the privilege of working with hundreds of leaders over the course of the last 20 years or so, and it's been pretty amazing how often we've seen leaders, well-intentioned, very capable leaders, do what seems like at times nonsensical, illogical, or things that don't help when it comes to engaging people or shaping culture, right? Almost to the point where you kind of really wonder how could they think that's really a smart thing to do, right? And so we took a step back and said, well, why is that? And what we actually found is that it's kind of natural for human beings to sort of get stuck in a certain way of thinking and assume that's kind of the best and the right way to go. And so we went actually into non-business environments to kind of validate that sort of thinking. And if you want to go to the next slide there, Tim.
Sure.
Just to give a few examples, right? And I think the first one is 1799 and George Washington. I think it's the previous slide there, Tim, actually, but either way, George Washington, about 18 months after retirement, was out on his farm and got a bit of a cold, and he was still in perfectly good health, and he was sending for doctors that first night. But the one thing he started doing, because it was an established norm at the time, was the art of bloodletting. Right, and so they got into bloodletting, and the next day 3 physicians showed up and they tried to diagnose what was really going on, and they did bloodletting 4 more times. To make a long story short, at the end of that day, George Washington got quite weak and said, "I feel myself passing. Thank you for all your help." And in retrospect, they found that between 40 to 50% of his blood was taken out via bloodletting. So there's still historians are still debating what exactly killed him, but they know that did not help, right? And so you could say, okay, how could somebody, a founding father, our first president, somebody that bright, actually think that's a good idea, right? This is a smart thing to do, right? This I think is going to help make things better, including all the physicians that were surrounding, right? But back then that seemed perfectly normal. Or alternatively, if you go back 100 years, fast forward to the 1890s. It was quite common to have cocaine toothache drops, right, for your kids of all reasons. Right? You think about that now, and you go, that's crazy, but that was kind of a norm, and you can just sort of see the dialogue that would potentially take place at home, right? Hey, honey, Annabelle seems to be a bit cranky, not herself today, right? It's oh, no worries, dear. Just slip her one of the cocaine, toothache drops, and she'll be off and running in no time, right? We look at that today and go, that's nuts, or just a couple more for fun as you go a little further into today's environment. If you want to go to the next slide there, Tim, you go to cigarettes, right? Not until the 60s when a lot of the research came out where we really understood the health impact. It was very fashionable and common, and smoking was everywhere to the point where there was essentially competition for which doctors and dentists would recommend the various cigarettes and the various benefits to you, right? And you're chuckling, you kind of look back and you go, I cannot believe those were not outliers, those were norms, right? Or if you go back, if you go to the next slide, one more example, carbonated soft drinks, right? Carbonated soft drinks ultimately were strongly recommended to be put with baby formula, right, as a way to get your toddler going in the morning, right? And whether that was 7-Up, Sprite, you name it, and that was as late as the 70s. Where you look back on that now that we have a better understanding, you go, that's ridiculous, right? That's just silly. And how could we think that was normal, right? And so in many ways, it's with the benefit of hindsight. Yes, it seems now that we have different information, different research, the societal and cultural norms have shifted, and we kind of go, okay, well, that seems crazy now, but back then that was kind of mainstream, right? And as we've thought about, and we think we've seen some of those same behaviors at the leadership level, right? Where we have things that almost kind of going back to Adam Smith and the industrial age, right? We have sort of some leadership principles that are so deeply embedded into what we do that they just seem normal. But we believe we're going to look 20 or 30 years from now, we're going to look back and go, we can't believe that was a great way of leading, right? That was a smart way of going about it. And so if you want to go to the next slide, which is essentially how do we define leadership blind spots, right? And it's areas where existing beliefs and experiences preclude us from having the most enlightened view of how to lead people effectively, right? And so what are the things that get in the way of leading people effectively? Because it's certain blind spots and beliefs leaders have on what the best thing to do is. And if you go to the next slide, that's consequential really for a couple of different reasons, right? The first one is it's just bad business practice, right? So 90% of strategies are suboptimized, right? 70% of change initiatives fail due to people issues, right? And a lot of that is because of how we lead, how we engage people, and how we shape the culture, right? And it's even more devastating in many ways because it's also the place where most of us spend the most time. 50 to 70% of people are somewhere between indifferent and disengaged in their jobs, right? And so not only is it a productivity issue, it's a bit of a human travesty. And while we all own our own engagement at work, it is the job of the leader to set the tone. It is the job of the leader to create the environment, to shape the culture that truly allows for organizations to be at their best selves and for people to be at their most engaged selves. And that was really our motivation. How can we shed light on these blind spots that as we looked at what are the most common ones that get in the way, often with the best of intentions, and how do we go after those? And there's 5, right? And they're about if you want to go to the next slide they're about purpose, they're about story, they're about engagement, they're about trust, and they're about truth, right? And we'll get into a bit of detail, and as much as we can on a webinar about each of these and provide a few insights on those.
So I guess 50 years from now, these 5 blind spots, we're going to look back and say, how on earth wasn't every organization, dealing with these subjects? It's just crazy. I can't imagine people wouldn't care about purpose, or people wouldn't care about engagement in real creative, progressive ways. So is that what we have to look forward to?
Yeah, I think that's what we have to look forward to. And I think that the devil is in the details and the nuances, right? Because even today, as we talk to organizations, we'll get into this, most will say, oh, no, it's, their purpose matters to us, right? But does it really, right? And engagement matters to us, but does it really? And so often we find, and this is what some of these blind spots are all about, which is we might even say it is important to us, but how we lead and what we do actually don't foster true engagement, foster true living your purpose. And so I think it's the ahas around what this actually means to bring it to life effectively is hopefully where people go, oh, I can't believe we thought this was going to drive engagement, right? Because it never did. It hasn't in the last 30 or 40 years, and it won't in the next 10 or 20 either. Jim, do you want to talk about purpose?
I would love to. So maybe the first blind spot really is that we find that purpose matters, but it doesn't drive the numbers. Purpose is something that's the gain speed without question, and a number of leaders are more interested in it than ever. But the real question is, even for those leaders, are they really connecting the dots between how they run the company on a day-to-day basis and linking it to a larger purpose. More realistic, whenever we run into some headwinds, it's really time to go back and focus on the business and get the numbers again, and then we can go back to purpose. And once we get things under control, there's a great example, and I don't know how many of you remember seeing it, but there was a Monster ad at a Super Bowl a number of years ago that said, a young child says, "When I grow up, I want to claw my way into middle management." Or there was another ad that said, "When I grow up, I want to be a yes man or a yes woman." And Monster was really good at that time. You deserve a better job, and we want to help you find it. The challenge was, I think, in around 2006, Monster was one of the 20 most used websites in the world. But by 2011, Monster rated as one of the worst stocks. And by 2014, the stock had dropped 93%. And what really, if you go back and look at it, the root cause for Monster's fall was they lost their purpose. They really focused on profit and not purpose. And it wasn't the loss of earnings that caused the loss of purpose. It was a loss of purpose that caused the loss of earnings.
One of the core challenges here is that 90 employees, to Jim's point, feel that their company understands the importance of purpose, but less than half actually believe that companies run in a purpose-driven way, right? And that's up to leaders, right? That goes at some of the essence of what Jim was talking about, and that raises real questions on are you really running your organization in a purpose-driven way, which is very different than having a purpose statement, right? And so if you want to kind of advance to a couple of slides, I think we've covered a lot of that, and I think we can go over the CVS example super briefly. But their purpose is helping people on their path to better health, and CVS was challenged with the issue of, if we really believe that, 4 billion of our sales, 2 billion of our sales are driven by tobacco sales, right? And so if we really believe our purpose, we have to fundamentally challenge that. And a couple of years ago, they stopped selling tobacco at a cost of that revenue line. But they did do studies, and did this actually impact society at large, or in the 8 largest markets where they were doing, where they had cut back, there was a significant decline, if you want to go to the next slide, Tim, a significant decline in consumption, actually 95 million fewer packs overall, right? And 1% decline in overall smoking in general, not just because of the decline in CVS stores, but that's putting your money where your mouth is. Now, I think time will tell, right? At this point, the jury is still out. Was that, quote unquote, a smart long-term move in terms of enhancing value for the organization? We believe so. I think they believe so, because the loyalty of your customers, the authenticity of your purpose, and the connection your employees have to what you really stand for is a great example. But being purpose-driven doesn't always mean it's the easy answer, right? It can be the tough answer. So maybe last slide here, just to kind of wrap up the purpose blind spot. And the ultimate question is are we creating an organization that focuses on bringing its purpose to life every day, or are we creating an organization that is focused on hitting its numbers every day, right? And hitting your numbers is important, but which comes first, right? And that's the question we want leaders to really think about, because often as you think about how they run their meetings, what they emphasize, how they engage the organization, is leading with the number, not leading with the purpose to create the number.
Right. That makes great sense. The CVS example, of course, resonates. Actually, I was there over the weekend getting my shots for that global trip I told you about, and I couldn't believe the clinic and how much a better experience that was than going to a doctor. But I think people can get the purpose connection in an organization like that. But if I'm making widgets or steel brackets or who knows what, but the connection to purpose is maybe not as clean and clear. Can you share a little bit about making that connection in organizations that might not have that clear of a connection to a very motivating purpose?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even for CVS, that was an evolution, right? If you kind of go back to where they were 20 years ago, because people often say, well, if you were a Whole Foods and you started out with a 7th generation, this is so much easier because that was your starting point, right? if you're doing something different. And I think what's really important here is your purpose, for it to be meaningful, it doesn't have to be to necessarily save the world, right? It is, how is it something meaningful that people can connect to? How do you make a meaningful contribution to whatever market you play in, to whatever part of an industry you're a part of, and you do that authentically, right? I think in many ways, most of us, don't show up to work wanting to be average, but we do want to be a part of something larger than ourselves, and that can sometimes be easier for the larger goals when it is healthcare, when it is whatever else it is. But actually, what we found with employees, that's not the single most important or the sole driver. It is, are we creating something together that we're proud of? Are we productive citizens in the industries we compete within? And does my contribution make a meaningful difference in that? Right? And those are all things that are well within the control of any leader in any organization, and can have a profound impact on how well people connect to it, and the clarity of purpose that guides the organization.
That makes sense. Well, let's go on to the next blind spot.
All right, so let's do the next blind spot. It's story, and the essence of it is, we have a compelling story to tell that our people care about, right? And the reality is they don't. And often that's the case, and you kind of see this in this little vignette here, is because the story isn't told well at all, right? And we often share a bunch of numbers and use a bunch of buzzwords that got taught to many of us in business school, and it really doesn't resonate to the great many, right? And that starts more often than not with, quite frankly, the vision statement, which is often the headline of an organization. And the vision statement is more often than not a very sort of generic, non-valuable headline to your story. And the book goes into great detail on how to think about that more effectively. Well, there's two things I want to focus on within story, above just the quality of the story itself. And that's really about the shared meaning we have around our story. Because we see things falling apart when leaders or larger teams don't have a common perspective, right? And to give you the simplest of examples, if I just asked everybody on the phone, if I said, when I say the word hometown, and you close your eyes and for 5 seconds you think about the imagery that comes to your head, right? What's the first thing that jumps into your head? And Tim, I don't know, what jumped into your head, Tim?
Pretty much flat streets and houses, big yards.
Yep. Well, that would be one picture that jumps into many people's heads, right? And others will say, I grew up in a city. Others will say, actually, it's food. It's the home cooking, right? It's my sports team. There's all kinds of different. It's the first emotion very often that comes with hometown. That's the picture that builds in people's minds. So when we've got 100 people in the room, you get lots of different imagery. The point of that being, and if you want to go to the next slide there, Tim, the point of that being is that as we think about the story of our organization and we think about important concepts, right? Let's say whether that is innovation, whether that is customer experience, right? And we say, what's that really look and feel like? While we might agree on the term, when we say what's really the story behind it, what's the meaning behind it, how do we activate that in the organization, we often have as many pictures in our heads, as many stories in our heads, as we have people in the room. And we have stories that have very different pictures associated with them and different meaning associated with them. You get vastly different levels of understanding and execution, right? And so most stories start to fail, A, because they're just not very effective stories, or B, even if they're an effective story, we don't have a common sense of shared meaning around that story. And as we cascade that, it starts falling apart. Right, and then lastly, another thing about story is, and then very often leaders underestimate the importance of telling it effectively and authentically, right? And so it's like a competition of who can at times even take a compelling story and make it more boring through a lot of slides and bullet points that takes any drama and emotion away from that story, right? And so how do you as a leader really get good and authentically embrace the story? And that by the way, that's, doing that effectively is hard for everybody, including the best, right? There's a fun story about Martin Luther King at the beginning of the civil rights movement, right? If you look at the next slide, and it was the March on Washington in the early 60s. There were hundreds of thousands of people there, and he was the culminating speech to really give this movement an extra push and an energy and an identity. And he had worked with his team the night before at the Willard Hotel, and they essentially had a 6-7 page script of all the things they wanted to cover. And the crowd was ready and thirsty for him. And he actually first started delivering the speech. It was more of a policy speech, right? And and today would say people got on their smartphones. Back then they didn't, but he wasn't grasping kind of them at their full attention until one of the folks he worked with said, Mahalia Jackson, she said, Martin, tell him about your dream. Tell him about the dream, right? Forget the policy paper, right? And he started telling us about the dream, his authentic version of what he believed, right, of his story that people could connect with. And the rest is history, right? And so as you're a leader, yes, there's the content of your story, but what's your authentic version, and how you tell it and how you connect with people is almost as important as the story itself, right? And so we tend to underestimate, going to the last slide of this one, we tend to underestimate the quality of the story, the shared meaning we have around it, and how effective we are at telling it, and the importance of engaging people effectively in what we do, right? And it's one of those breakdowns we've seen time and time again with leaders over the past 20 years. So I'll stop there, Tim. But that's the second blind spot.
All right. Well, that definitely resonates like crazy. I love the Cotter quote that most leaders under-communicate their vision or their picture of the future by 10 times, 100 times, or even 1,000 times. So you guys are in getting that story straight and even making it visual in many cases.
Yep, absolutely. Perfect.
All right. We're on to blind spot 3.
All right, let's go to blind spot 3, right, which is about engagement. So ultimately here, it's rational and logical presentations engage the hearts and minds of people, right? And as you can see in the vignette, we often like to tell, but we tend to lose those we're trying to reach, right? Kind of just to build on what we just talked about. And fundamentally at its core, there's a belief that we have that people will tolerate what you have to say, but act based on their own conclusions, right? And so how do we ultimately create an environment where people can come along on a journey, can process information in a way that honors their intellect, and come to their own conclusions about where we're trying to go as a business versus being sold and told into the way they should behave? And not only is it not smart, it's just not effective. And we keep doing it again and again and again. And we actually, Drew, if you want to go to the next slide there, Tim, to kind of show that the challenge with engagement, we kind of drew what often happens in organizations when that dialogue doesn't happen, right? When these disconnects don't happen, right? And what you kind of see here is the disconnect, the organizational discord that gets in the way with leaders at the top left just trying to figure out, this goes to shared meaning and their own agenda and how all the pieces connect and fit. Managers are sort of kind of thrown in the middle and are trying to connect the leaders on the top left and the doers, which you see sort of on the front right. There's a canyon with all kinds of external forces putting pressure on an organization and constantly creating change. And then on the far right, you have customers who are just trying to, is anybody paying any attention to me in this chaos of change that kind of your organization seems to be going through, right? And that leads to kind of disconnect and lack of execution. And how do we really drive a different kind of organizational conversations, right? And we use very often visualization and visual mental models to create a different kind of dialogue where people are part of the process. And actually, we've collaborated here in the past, Tim, on creating some of this together. So if I could actually kind of turn it to you to kind of share a little bit on this subject as well.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, as you know, I've been a big fan of your work, not just the visualization efforts, but just your approach to change and building an organizational movement. But about a year ago, we started collaborating on creating an educational tool. And this learning map is it when it comes to the culture journey, from the left side being much more about history or the legacy and foundation forces that affect our culture, to the middle being norms, the expectations that are really driving the current state, and the culture fog that might exist, improvement paths and things people are trying to get better in different teams, to really show how leadership impacts the current state. But I'd love you to share, when you work with one organization and really it's their customer experience or something else, how does it work? Because we created this as an educational tool. How does it work to engage people and basically shine light on this blind spot of engagement and challenge that's out there?
Yeah. Yeah. Let me answer that. Actually, I'll tell you a story, right, of a real client story 2 years ago where we were with a ceiling tile plant manufacturer, a ceiling tile manufacturer, and we were in. I think it was in the deep south, and it was in the summer. So it was we were in a plant. I think it was like 110 degrees, probably it felt like 160, right? And the air conditioning working like crazy. And we this organization was going through profound change, international competition, pricing pressures. There was restructuring, and our work was all around how to engage the organization in the process restructuring, and then a new gain sharing plan, right? And as we got to that plant, it's these were folks largely with a high school education, all walks of life, and we needed to engage them in this, and they were highly skeptical when we first showed up. They're like, "Oh, great, another set of consultants. We can't wait," And so we walked them through something similar, like a way to engage them in conversation. And a colleague of mine was at the table trying to facilitate the conversation, get the dialogue going, and I was sitting next to the plant manager, Larry, and things were off to a slow start. Once again, because I think really the thought bubbles in people's heads were more about, are they here to judge me? What if I'm not smart enough? What is this all about? I don't trust these people. I don't know them, right? The normal human reactions when you have this sort of thing happening. And so we're off to a slow start, and I could see Larry was getting fidgety, right? And he was sort of, he clearly was not there on his own accord. He was told by corporate to support this thing. And so I'm trying to calm him down. I'm like, I gotta calm him down, or this thing is going to go south before we ever even get started, right? And so I lean over and I say, "Hey, Larry, it's okay. This stuff always starts out a little bit slow, and just wait till we really get the conversation going and the light bulbs go on, and it'll be profound in terms of the ahas we can have." And he leans over, and one of my, probably all-time favorite lines, he goes, "Rich, you got to understand, my people ain't got no light bulbs, and you and I are in for a long afternoon, right?" So I'm going, "Holy cow, you got to be kidding me," right? Anyhow, to make a long story short, the conversation did pick up, right? We really engage people in the conversation. They exchange ideas and have dialogue, and we do a debrief at the end of the 2 hours, and we kind of say, "Hey, what's working for you? What's not working for you?" And there's a guy who's probably worked there 25 years in his mid to late 50s, and he starts off and he says, I've been with this organization for well over 2 decades, and this is the first time in that time period that somebody truly asked me for my opinion, and for that I want to say thank you, right? We got a little choked up, and the rest of the group sort of nodded their heads, and I could see Larry's reaction, right? I think we changed him a little bit forever that day, because he realized that these people do have light bulbs, right? And I think in many ways we underestimate the collective capability of our people if we truly engage them, if we engage them in conversation. If ultimately this is not about sell and tell, but we engage them in the difficult issues, and we honor their intellect and their ability to contribute and be a part of something. And so the next time you have something important to communicate, how do you make them part of the process? How do you create conversations and dialogue in an organization? And it's amazing at the dormant human capital that exists if we only tap into it, right? And we use all kinds of creative methods like you see here, but you can do that without those, right? And so that was profound for us. I think that was profound for Larry, and it just speaks to the power of thinking about engagement in a different way.
Yeah, what I love about this is, we talk about culture making the invisible visible with these types of techniques, and what's really running through people's minds. What are people thinking? What are people saying? What are people doing? And it's just amazing when you get people talking about this and sharing. It's so much easier to build positive things out of it. And one of my favorite shine points is that culture builds through shared learning and mutual experience. So it's this going through one experience, maybe it's one of your creative learning methods or others, but it's always connected to a result.
That's right.
Experience is something I know you connect to often, so that then people just get used to this process of engaging people around it, building it up together, figuring it out together, and can apply it, in one case to customer experience, but then take the approach to other problems and challenges with their team. So you get such mileage out of it beyond the one problem you might have engaged around originally. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Could not agree more.
Well, I had lots of questions while you were explaining that. This sounds interesting. How's it all work? Just real briefly, can you explain how a learning map experience works and what tools support it?
Yeah. So just on this specific way, right? As we said, there's lots of different ways of driving conversation, but in this specific way, it's and then first you see here, let's think of a 3 by 5 foot visual view of a system, right? And so there's great power, quite even frankly, in building it, because as you build it, creates a great sense of alignment, right? Very often, any sort of strategies or pieces of information that we present in PowerPoints force us to go in a linear way of thinking, right? And that's quite frankly often not how strategy, how topics work. And so one is a visual depiction of a system. But then really what's most important is it's groups of 8 to 10, and we found 8 to 10, sometimes between 6 and 10, from ideally different backgrounds, right? Different functional backgrounds, to have a conversation through structured dialogue. So we might have 40 to 45 questions. We might have additional data, and those folks of 8 to 10 might spend an hour and a half working through a visual like this through structured dialogue. They have different ahas, have different insights, and learn from one another. The real power is in the dialogue and in the conversations and having new ahas and new learnings, right? We live in a world these days where it seems most of us aren't exposed to environments, aren't open enough to hear different perspectives, right? And learn from one another. This is exactly meant to do that, and then replicate it at scale. So whether we've worked with organizations as few as 1,000 people and as many as 300,000 people, right? And these conversations would be replicated in groups of 8 to 10 at scale in a digital or non-digital environment, so that we might have 1,000 conversations that are in some ways unique because everybody brings their own perspective. But they're amazingly consistent because we're working off of the same mental model, the same visual, and the same dialogue. And it's a great way to create organizational alignment at scale and to build momentum around strategy at scale and really create ownership of something at scale, because we didn't sell and tell, we authentically engaged.
Awesome. Well, we better get moving to hit our last blind spots. Trust.
Absolutely, and we got 2 more, I think. So we have to get Boogie in here. Trust. So I'll go through this one pretty quickly, but and as you see, people will not do the right thing unless you tell them what to do and hold them accountable to do it. Right? That's sort of a core belief that I got to tell them exactly what to do, define the processes exactly, because if not, they're likely going to screw up. Especially if we have a lot of units of something or lots of people, right? And what that creates is great mediocrity, right? We were working with a fast food chain restaurant that had performance differences in comparable restaurants where the sales were between 1.2 and 2.2 million. Profound, right? And ultimately, they wanted us to, why is that and what can we do about it? The challenge that they had is ultimately that in their core belief, they were very prescriptive and very operationally driven. So this was all about cost control. As they defined successful operations at a restaurant, it was about cost controls and processes and sort of a very tight way of managing. Now, that got them great consistency, but as they studied the great restaurants, they found that they actually didn't do that, right? They did a couple of things differently. One is they invested and engaged their people more effectively, but the other one is they were a lot more focused on top line and then managing the variable costs to support the various levels of demand that they could create. And so what they did with the greater level of engagement, for example, is the employees were much more engaged in how do we get the local soccer teams or softball teams to come to our restaurant. Once we know we can do that and drive the number, we can figure out the variable staffing versus we're going to get yelled at because our costs were over the budgeted periods for whatever the shifts were. Make a long story short, we worked with the leadership team and we said, this is about challenging your core beliefs. And if you want to go to the trust statement on the next slide there, Tim, this is what they admitted to themselves. We claim that we are customer maniacs. Sorry, I lost the screen. We claim that we're customer maniacs, but in the end, we are finance and control maniacs who don't trust our people, would do the right thing for our customers and our business if we took the controls off, right? So it says, as much as we talk about customers, as much as we talk about all these things, in the end, if we look at our numbers, our controls, and how we run the business, this is the truth, right? And what we find in a lot of organizations, a lot of leadership teams we deal with is that this dichotomy exists. We talk about customer centricity, but then we talk about everything we do in the organization that actually gets in the way of truly creating great customer experiences. Now, what this will get you is it minimizes variability. It can create some consistency, but you will never get extraordinary performance, right? And the simplest way to think about this is if you want to go to the next slide, as we were looking at this, is the question I would ask anybody on the phone is, how are you running your business? Is it more like a roundabout? Or is it more like an intersection, right? And if you think about an intersection, the rules at an intersection are extremely well defined, right? If something happens, you know who's at fault, right? Was it a red light? Did they run a red? Did they take the wrong turn, et cetera, et cetera? So it's very easy to define right and wrong. But if you also look at an intersection, the number of touch points and conflict points are extreme, and actually traffic flow can be pretty slow, versus a roundabout, where a roundabout is ultimately based on trust, right? And when something happens, it's actually harder to figure out, but it's much more about knowing kind of the baseline of the rules, and from there, trusting that everybody kind of plays the game the right way. And if you study the flow of traffic, the throughput, and the effectiveness, it's much, much greater, right? And you have far fewer conflict points. And so in many ways, this can apply to your business, right? And then the question I would ask everybody is, are you running your business more like a roundabout philosophically, right? Where you define some hard lines, but you ultimately trust that you will get great execution? Or is it more like an intersection where everything is defined, people will follow the rules, but you slow down the process, or you slow down an ability to do unique things, right? And so that's kind of a core question. Now, depending on the type of business that you are, there's different lines, right? If you're running a nuclear power plant, you're going to lean towards more intersection sort of non-negotiables that you need to have, right? And so you have to define in your business where your lines are, but there's a real philosophical question as you think about your processes, your legal checks and everything else. Often leaders don't know that everything in their organization is set up to run their business like an intersection, and it gets in the way of people having an ability to be a best version of themselves.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think when I think about trust, I think a lot about leaders walking the talk, especially when it comes to culture and leadership and things like that. I'd love for you to give an example or two of trust, more from Root's perspective, because you're leading Root. And I've been to your headquarters, interacted with many members of your team. It sure seems like you guys walk the talk on, having a purpose-driven organization, really engaging people in creative ways internally, and empowering people in some exciting ways. Do you have any examples on how Root operates in a roundabout way?
Yeah, we're far from perfect, obviously, but we try, right? And I would say we might be operating in an extreme roundabout way, right? We've got about 160 folks, and about a third of them are creatives, and then another half are sort of MBAs, and we kind of put them together, and that by itself, I think it's even at the core of what we do. Most of our people have to trust folks who have skills that they're absolutely not familiar with, right? That the conceptor doesn't not have studied kind of business school principles or analytics and all that it's required. And the MBA, when they join us, are somewhere between in awe and shock and and scared of this tremendously different skill of visualizing, of whether it's design, whether it's concepting. And so even at the outset of what we do, it requires a tremendous amount of trust because you don't have the skills to be in control, right? So that's sort of core to ultimately to our DNA and what we believe in and kind of how we run our business.
That's awesome. I can appreciate that new hire reaction, because I tell people when I went to Root the first time, it was like culture Disneyland with the visual everywhere, and it was just a very cool experience. So we better get on to the last blind spot.
Yep. The last blind spot is truth, and it's my people feel safe telling me what they really think and feel, right? And it's amazing how many leaders feel that that's the case, but how often that's really not entirely true, right? And maybe just a quick story. We're working with a large global financial services organization, and they said, hey, we need to have a better culture of truth telling. Can you help us? Can you have us honest conversations? And so we designed a session for a leadership team, about 120 of them, where we went after kind of the things that people only talk about in the hallways, and we brought them into the room, right? And whether that is questions on the strategy, whether it's questions on the culture, whether it's questions, and even the kind of conversations we're quote unquote allowed to have. And we had done some interviews to get at the truths, that were out there. And I still remember we had 120 people in groups of 8 to 10, right, to kind of foster the dialogue we just talked about earlier. And people were high-fiving us, giving us thumbs up, saying, we've never had conversations like this. This is absolutely fantastic. This is really making great progress. Well, the one mistake we had made is we hadn't checked off with the strategy guy. The strategy guy was one of the 120. And some of the truths we found were not the most flattering about the strategy. So he got all worked up. He ran to the CEO. He complained. And next thing you know, things went a little south from there. And next thing you know, we got summoned following day by the CEO. And he said, he went back to all those people you interviewed, and none of them claimed that they gave you the content that you found. And so we're just curious where you got this information from, right? Because it doesn't seem to make any sense. So we kind of knew, we're like, okay, this will be a defining moment of whether this is truly a client or whether we're just better off not being in business together, right? And we said, well, that really in the end gives you two choices, right? The one is that we have a vivid imagination, which we do, and just like to cause controversy, right? Or the second one is that your people were way more comfortable telling us the truth than they were telling you the truth, right? And if you believe the latter, we can help if you're willing to kind of go on that journey, right? And we had about 5 seconds of silence, which felt like 30, right? And we got a laugh and a chuckle, and he goes, okay, you got me, so let's get to work. So and then that's been a client for a long, long time. But the point being is, telling the truth can be hard, and there's lots of things that get in the way, and there's lots of emotions. And if you want to go to the next slide there, Tim, just to share some of the emotions, right? Either from an employee or from a leader perspective. And I think we've all experienced or felt, right? If I'm an employee, why might I not tell the truth? It's because if I speak up and disagree, will I be the team member who doesn't get to play, right? Can I be sure my comments will be taken the right way and my intention is for the good of the business? Or will they say this is Debbie Downer, he always talks negative? Or is it, if I talk about things from my perspective, will people think less of me because of my answers? Will they think I'm not smart enough, right? If I say what I really think, could that be a career limiting move, right? And so in many ways, those are the fears that unless somebody makes me comfortable that I'm going to not get judged this way, I might not share the truth because I don't feel safe, right? And then from a leader standpoint, you can make the same kind of an argument, right? And because leaders have to be very receptive to tell the truth. And a leader might say, I'm not fostering this environment because it might be an indictment of my leadership. They think I'm a bad leader, or I don't have all the answers, or whatever, and I'm supposed to, I think. If I really open the kimono, will we just have a complaint session, right? Or I'm not comfortable with how vulnerable I have to be if we really put everything on the table. And this whole vulnerability thing sounds great, but I don't know. I'm not comfortable with it, right? And so if you're a leader, you have to have great awareness around sharing and showing those emotions, because if people sense those, they're not going to tell you the truth. And you have to actually be extra careful to make sure employees feel safe so the things on the left side of the slide don't happen, because everything in your organization as a leader most likely works against the truth being told. You have to go out of your way to create an environment that fosters it, right? And therefore, you have to be really aware of the things that get in the way. Because ultimately, and if you go back to, if you go to the next slide, or actually you can jump one ahead. As we think about authentic and inauthentic power, how do you display that the right way? Inauthentic is, I have more than you do, I know more than you do, and I am more than you are. And we've all been around leaders where we've felt that. But that does not create followership, right? Rarely does. Versus authentic power, which is about compassion, vulnerability, and empathy, right? And if you create those, you can create an environment of truth-telling. And when you do, your ability to have bad news get to you faster, your ability to be agile, your ability to have a culture and an environment that is faster moving, more supportive, more engaged, are profoundly different, right? And so truth-telling is a really critical blind spot that leaders often are unaware of in terms of their ability and their role in shaping the culture of creating them.
So where do you find the balance? I mean, if I go back to some of the examples you were showing, the reality in many organizations, every organization is going to have situations on the left where there's fear and uncertainty, either situationally or quite often. And you're engaged in a customer experience improvement effort. I mean, how much of the current state do you put out there, on the learning map or in your tools, and how much is, we want more of the ideal to be out there? How do you find the balance of really putting all this in front of people, but also being clear about what we're targeting?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, right? And we often talk about, if you really want to drive change, it's both, right? You have to define reality, and then you have to create a compelling future state. And I think I would say is you have to define enough of the reality for it to be authentic and real, right? If you're not talking about the real issues or the things that people really believe are getting in the way of us getting to the future state, you're making a mistake, even if it's uncomfortable, right? Because it's amazing how freeing it can be when we can have an honest conversation. And if you do it the right way, it is not about indicting anybody or anything. It's just about getting really clear our core beliefs, what gets in the way, and where we go from here, right? And so we will say, as honest as we need to be, and obviously balance with as honest as we're comfortable to be. When we often work with leaders, you have to also gauge, you can't expect a leader or leadership team to go further than they're comfortable with. And sometimes it takes some time and experience, right, to say, if you've never been vulnerable, to kind of go to the extreme is probably not smart. So how do you gain some experiences that build confidence that they go, oh, wow, I had a more of an open conversation than we historically had, and it was really productive and constructive conversation. And I think we got there faster than we would have otherwise. Let's push the envelope further. So it's, what does the issue require, and what's the current culture? So what's the level of comfort with how much of that you can push to make the greatest progress? So it's an art as much as it is a science.
Yeah, I definitely want to reemphasize those 2 points for everyone listening, as far as being as honest as we need to be, but really tempering that based on how comfortable we are right now from where we're at. That we're not all just going to make that from to shift to the ideal overnight, and just getting people to start sharing at one organization is a huge accomplishment, where at another, if we're covering up anything that's critical, it could hold us back.
Absolutely.
All right, so here, what's going on with your final truth slide?
So the final truth, I think, what can we do as leaders to make it safe for people to tell the truth and act on those truths to make the business better, right? I mean, I think it's how do you create that sort of environment is one of those key blind spots for leaders to be aware of, and then kind of find their best way given their comfort level.
Okay. Excellent. Tell us about your assessment.
Oh yeah, I think if for those interested to say, either my team or myself, how do I do on
Can you
these
tell
slides,
us about
right?
your assessment?
Yep, there's if you're curious about kind of finding out your own blind spots or your teams, as you see here on the There's a web link that has an assessment that takes about 5 to 7 minutes that gives you a read on your strengths and opportunity areas as it relates to these 5 blind spots. So that's free. There's no strings attached. So whoever is curious, it's also in the book in hard copy. So it's out there as a resource for people.
Okay, and where can everyone get the book?
The book should be in most major bookstores, certainly on Amazon. It's out there now in audio, Kindle, and hard copy version.
All right, so we didn't have Jim on due to our audio difficulties, but I know he's as inspiring as you are with the importance of this work and the clarity. So any final comments for our audience? We still have about 110 on.
I think first one is thank you for being with us here for the full hour, and I think in many ways what I would say is it's a time where our folks and our organizations that we work in are looking for leadership, maybe more than ever in the past, because there's lots of places where we historically have gotten it where we might not be getting it, right? And so I think the ability to be self-aware and be the best version of yourself, and kind of be that enlightened leader where maybe people 20 years from now will say, wow, those were practices that we were dealing with in my organization that were not the norm back then, but we were very enlightened with how we thought of this. Hopefully this gives you some insight that helps you be the best version of yourself.
Awesome. Well, apologize everybody for the technical difficulties we had. We'll get the information from this webinar out there in some other forms. Someone just had a question. They missed the book title. Again, it's What Are Your Blind Spots? Available on Amazon and everywhere else. And Rich, thanks so much. Really have enjoyed collaborating with your team. Love how you guys walk the talk and overcome these blind spots yourself, and look forward to collaborating more in the future and sharing all your great work. So thanks so much, Rich.
Likewise, Tim. Thanks for being you. You take care.